Hello, Chris Sexton here with TeamHeliPros.com. This is the second in my Whiplash 90E build series. If you watched the previous video, last night we got through the main frame. Pretty much got the frame completely assembled. I did not put the motor and Sprag gear together just yet. I'm gonna build the entire airframe and get into the Sprag gear and motor when I'm doing the head setup. But it's a really solid, really impressive frame. Got some cool stuff going on with the tail control. Nice big beefy 2mm CF with some frame reinforcements. Really nice build. I'm not going to bore you with too much details on the frame since you watched the previous video. I do want to take a quick second and talk about some of the components that go into the tail. As you can see, I have everything laid out here. Black tail boom, pretty straightforward, has Excel etched in it rather nicely. They don't have a carbon tail control rod. That's okay. I'm a little bit surprised by that. Helicopter of this caliber, I really expected to see a carbon tail, but you know what? The metal push rods have been sufficing for a very long time. You've got 4 push rod guides. It's not going to bend on you. You should be fine. One nice touch, the tail support rods do come with the ends already epoxied on, which is a really nice touch. Good factory seal on those. I'm always leery if I'm using the right components when I glue mine up. It's nice that's already done. Little dimple there denotes that side has a slight bend towards that side, which makes tightening it at the frame and the boom support clamp nice and easy, and there's no flexing of the rod. The Whiplash 90 is a torque tube helicopter. It's pretty straightforward aluminum torque tube, nothing fancy there. They do use these removable torque tube gears. I'm not sure what you call it, tip, spline, but it does go on, has a nut and bolt that goes through it to retain it, makes it easy to service later. Typical torque tube setup. They do give us 2 torque tube gear bearings. These are kind of similar to the Gowie setups. It's a plastic housing that the bearing is in, and they give you these rubber O-rings that you lubricate, slide it together with. I'm seriously considering building mine using the Align rubber holders for the torque tube bearings. If for nothing else, just because there were some reports of issues with these causing vibes with the torque tubes because the plastic O-rings don't dampen as well. I don't know. A lot of guys running these. I don't remember seeing anywhere posted guys changing out the torque tube bearings. So, you know, second thought, I probably will put it together with these. I'm not hearing any reports of causing problems with the miniature aircraft stuff. If I have a vibe problem, that'll be the first thing I check, I promise you. Boom clamps, again, CNC aluminum. These are a little bit different from each other. One requires some parts bolted to it, one doesn't. But it's nice to know it's pre-drilled so you can pin the boom. That's a nice touch. Look at this transmission. This is beautiful. All one solid piece of CNC aluminum. Again, that brushed finish that Miniature Aircraft loves to do. Big, massive. I'm not sure those are Mod 1 or Mod 1.25, but those are massive torque tube gears. The mesh on these is predetermined, so I'm hoping they know what they're doing and got it right. I'm sure they do. But that's just an absolutely beautiful, nice, smooth bearings. Solid piece of aluminum. It's not going to flex. Being that it's aluminum and not plastic, I see a lot of torque tube drives that the front boom transmission mount is plastic, and they wonder why things flex. That's nice and solid. Again, I'm not one of these guys that thinks you should put metal on everything. Like on my Furion, I did not replace the plastic in the tail. It flies fine, but this is a critical piece of the bird. I'm very happy to see that's aluminum. Nice and solid, not going to give. Massive rear tail box. Again, massive gears, liquid smooth bearings. One piece of solid CNC aluminum again. Looks like they actually have a collar on the shaft to help hold it in place. Pull the screws out of the gears, loosen the collar, and the whole shaft will come out. That's a nice touch. That way you can get away with a solid piece of aluminum. A lot like the X7 tail. Very solid. It's not going to give. It's just, again, brushed aluminum, very beautiful. Very smooth. I love it. Now you'll see this a little bit later, but I'm a big fan of putting a little the Triflow synthetic grease on those gears. It's not necessarily required, but I think I've got it in my head that it adds to the life of the gear, so that's what we're going to do. Big tail fin, nothing special there. Nice design, I like that shape, but tail fins included. Again, metal, all metal tail hub on these. Again, captured nut for the blade grip. That's nice. We have to put pliers on it. Leading edge control, pretty straightforward. Like most things, I don't know if you can see this real well from the camera. You've got two radial bearings and a thrust bearing. The inner race is actually down in the blade grip, and I read online those are pressed down in there pretty good. I didn't want to force it out, so I left the inners in the grips. I recommend you do that. If it's loose, that's fine, but I read on the Helifreak forums that Miniature Aircraft did pre-lubricate these, which is a nice touch, but I'm not one to leave anything alone. I pulled it apart, and I'm going to put my red tri-flow grease on it. But I did leave the inner in there. There's no sense in forcing it out. The pitch control slider, pretty straightforward. Again, brushed aluminum, nice brass collar. Smooth bearing, feels good. Everything's tight. Plastic links again. We talked about last night. That's standard in the industry anymore. No problems at all. Nice metal. I like this. I like this. Metal link ball screwed into the metal part, into a metal collar on the outside of this pitch slider. I've seen too many of these be made out of plastic and that ball strip and cause tail control problems. That's metal on metal. I will pull that out and make sure it's Loctited in, but that's a nice touch. That's going to hold up for a good long time. I like that. Then you've got your tail controls. This comes out and gives you a pivot point for your tail control itself, but the arm itself is metal. Radial bearings on both sides, nice and beefy. Brushed aluminum look again. That's going to hold up well. I like that. All in all, I'm very impressed with the tail. The tail components keep up with the quality of the main frame. Not a huge surprise there. I'm going to take a few seconds to start assembling things. Next time we cut in, I'll have the torque tube together. Probably have the torque tube in the boom. I might even be fitting this transmission into the frame. We'll see how far I get. But I'm going to start with clearing my workbench, build the tail rotor, grease up the bearings, get that all together, let that Loctite start drying. And I'll check back when I got that done. Thanks. Alright, I'm going to take a moment to update you here. I am working on the tail hub. I've got the CF arm that supports and gives you the pivot point for the control arm. Very heavy duty 3mm CF, pin nut already pressed in, very easy. Goes on with 2 3mm bolts, piece of cake. I want to talk about the metal control arm for a second. This does have 2 radial bearings with a spacer, pretty straightforward. The end that the tail push rod goes onto is a typical ball into metal, Loctite, no problems there. The cup that holds the ball for the pitch slider is actually plastic with a 2.5mm bolt going through it. Now I wanted to point this out. This is a plastic part being bolted to a metal threads. Now while the bolt goes into metal threads, you're still passing through a plastic part. Be careful. Don't go nuts and torque down on this. A, it's a 2.5mm thread. It's going to strip easy. And B, you don't need to over torque this plastic and distort it. Just cinch it down tight, let the Loctite do its job. You don't want to distort this. If you distort this plastic, you run the risk of it binding on the ball, and you don't want that. So just a quick tip there. Next I'm going to put the hub together, and we'll cut back in. Alright, as you can see, I now have the tail hub together. A couple things I want to point out real quick. One, liquid smooth. This is a pretty standard thing in the helicopter world these days, but inner and outer radial bearing with an actual thrust bearing. Greased it up again with my red Loctite on the thrust bearings. Excuse me, not Loctite. Red synthetic grease on the bearings. This is just really liquid smooth. I love it. One other thing I wanted to point out, and I don't think I talked about this on my Furion build, but I should have, because it was true on there too. Where a lot of helicopters use a brass bushing with a bolt going through it to secure the tail pitch slider to the tail grip, these guys actually use a ball and a link setup. The advantage there, what always happens, you're trying to put Loctite on that bolt so it doesn't back out of the grip. You get it on the brass bushing by mistake, it binds on the plastic and get tail binding. Voila, no problem. Put an actual ball on it. The links on the tail pitch slider are ball links. Piece of cake. Easy to maintain, easy to go together, very little risk of binding. It's absolutely liquid smooth. Just like the Fury, you have 2 set screws holding the hub to the shaft. I'll put that together in a minute. Encapsulated nuts for the blade grips, talked about that. Just really well made. It goes together well, everything's snug down. The grub bolts on this are actually a 3mm bolt. It's a 3x 8mm. It's the same big bolt that holds the frame together. Now I did use red Loctite on the grub screws. Unfortunately, I have had a blade grip come apart, so I use a little red Loctite. But one word of caution: anytime you're using Loctite on a bolt going through a bearing, put a little Loctite on the bearing. I like to take a loose rag like this and just kind of work it into the threads. There's not a bunch of extra on there. That way, less chance of squeezing out into the bearing. Because particularly with red Loctite, you get Loctite on that bearing, it's gonna bind. And these are liquid smooth. Tail is going together beautifully, as you can see. I got the tail pitch slider on, control arms together, beefy tail shaft. It's beautiful. Next, I'm going to go ahead and make these guys up, tighten this down, and we'll move on to the torque tube. One thing I want to talk about real quick, and this is going to be really hard for you guys to see, so I'm going to hold it over the white of the manual here. But this the set screws that go into the tail hub to hold it to the shaft have a little, collar is probably the wrong word, but it has a shaft that actually protrudes past the set screw and goes into these dimples on the tail shaft. That is going to make it impossible for this tail to the hub to rotate on the shaft. So just be sure when you're putting this together that when you line up the tail hub, the end of that set screw goes into those little dimples, and there's dimples on both sides, one for each set screw. Little tip: it'll tighten down, sure, if you don't hit the dimple, but it's just going to be extra locked in, Loctite on the set screw. Get the shaft on the end of the set screw into the dimple on the tail shaft, and no worries. All right, here we go, guys. The completed tail hub. I've got some. This is where the tail fin mounts. Of course, that's the clamp for the boom, and then the pin it goes through there as well. But the mechanics are there. Tail control arm, very smooth. There ain't no resistance there at all. Tail hub together, very smooth assembly. No surprises there at all. Spins free. Love it. That's gonna fly great. I'm just sure of it. We're going to move on to the tail boom. I'm going to put the torque tube bearings on the torque tube, put the ends on, get the boom together, and next time we talk, we'll be mounting this transmission. Alright, well, torque tube is together. I want to talk about something real quick. At first glance, I thought this was going to be a typical bolt going through with a nut on the end, but actually what they've done is they've given you 3 2.5mm by 4mm bolts for each of the torque tube ends, and they're staggered on where they bolt in, evenly spaced around for balance purposes, obviously, but different thicknesses into the shaft so they don't touch each other. Be very careful with those. This material that the actual cog is made out of is very soft. I actually almost cross-threaded one. It's pretty easy. Take a second to make sure you're lined up properly. Use a good Loctite. I would not use red here. You'd be surprised how often you'll need to take these off, change a bearing, or if you wreck, you can buy just a torque tube, but not these. But blue is sufficient for those. There's not really any pressure on them. Just be careful when you tighten them up. Don't over tighten them. Again, this is soft. You strip the threads. Let the Loctite do its job. Also point out, this is a 2 torque tube bearing setup. Make sure these are spaced different intervals. From here to here, here to here, and here to here should all 3 be different lengths. The reason for that's pretty simple. This is long enough shaft that if you put the torque tube bearing right smack dab in the middle, you're going to have harmonic, it's going to vibrate, and harmonic frequencies are going to come into play, and you can cause vibrations. By staggering the lineup on these, the lengths of these counteract the ability for it to cause harmonic vibrations. You can still bend one, so be careful. Don't bend it, put it together. Also remember, the caps on these are open on one end, so that you can get the bearings out to replace just the bearing. The instructions say to do this, and I also recommend it. Make sure these caps are facing the same direction. Just makes it easier for install of the new bearings. little bit of CA. I use a medium CA, put a little on it, slowly kind of dab it on, wick it on. Nice and solid, yet not interfering with the bearing at all. Again, I toyed with the idea of not using these O-ring and plastic bearing retainers and using more something line T-Rex style all soft rubber, but you know, they work. I haven't heard anybody complain about it, so we're going to put it together. But I wanted to talk about these gears and emphasize how important it is not to put those torque tube bearings evenly spaced. Well guys, tail boom is together. The tail box is on. Got the control arms on. The tail hub is together. The transmission. This is really slick setup. The boom is pinned at both the front and the rear. This bolt here is actually a 12 millimeter. Goes all the way through here, through the hub, into a pre-drilled hole in the boom. It is impossible for this boom to rotate without something breaking. It is absolutely great. I did forget to put the tail pitch slider slides on. That's no problem. It's really just 3 bolts up here. The front will come off and I can slide them on. So I'll do that real quick. I won't bother to bore you that, but I did notice it. And I'm going to get posts in the forums. Hey, you forgot your pitch slider control arms. Yeah, I noticed. But it's a really easy build. Torque tube went together really well. Put a little lube on those O-rings on the torque tube bearing holders. Slid right on. Just used my silicone, Triflow silicone clear grease, just a little bit. Just lubricated the O-rings so they didn't roll on the retainer. And the tube is nice and smooth. I like it. Very beefy. It's a definite weight here, so you know it's definitely a 700 bird. It's going to hang way off the back. And I'm going to fix my control arm sliders, and then we will go ahead and mount this guy into the frame. Probably go ahead and, against my better judgment, I think I'm going to go ahead and put the skids on the frame, just so this will sit, because the tail fin has to go on to pin the boom. So I had to go ahead and do that. So I'll go ahead and put the skids on the bird so it will sit right. And then we can start playing with the motor. There you are. Tail, pitch, controller arm, guides installed. I did fix it. Piece of cake. 3 bolts up here, 2 clamp bolts. 2 clamps and a pin. They come right off. I re-Loctite up my pin. I'm not going to Loctite these clamps until I have the transmission in the frame, because this back one will rotate. So I need to have that loose so I could slide it through the frames. But then I'll put some Loctite on those clamp bolts. But straightforward. Now we're going to start putting the main airframe back together. Okay. Well, I know I said I was going to put the boom into the frame first, but the instructions have us putting electronics on before you mount the boom. And I got thinking about it. That is an absolutely fantastic idea. For every reason I didn't put the skids on it yesterday. I got to get in here and work tight in here, line my servos up, test fit the main shaft, see if I, pre-mount my servos. It makes sense. I'm glad that I went ahead and read a couple steps ahead on the instructions, because having the boom on there would have made that interesting. Unfortunately, well, fortunately, I guess. That means I get to play with this Sprag gear setup next. Now, I looked through the instructions on this pretty closely. It's nothing fancy. Basically, what you've got is this is the pinion, and that pinion is pre-installed. It comes pre-installed, but here's the actual pinion. Inside here is your one-way bearing. They call it a Sprag gear. Basically, the pinion slides through into it like that. This does come pre-assembled. It's very well oiled. I'm not going to oil it. There's oil everywhere. Basically, you get the one-way pinion effect. So as the motor spins, it's tight, grabs the pinion. But as the motor stops, the gear can still spin, just like a one-way bearing. So instead of having a hub with a one-way bearing on the hub, it's built into the pinion. And I've seen that before. I believe it's the Protoss with the belt that is both the main that drives the main gear and the tail and the gear and the motor. I believe it's the Protoss. Has something very similar to that. So it's pretty neat. It's very beefy. Set up for the shaft there, no problem. This is going to slide down over the motor. So instead of having the pinion mount set screws to the motor, you've got set screws in this Sprag hub. The pinion kind of floats, but that's why it has this lower pinion. So this is going to actually encapsulate the whole assembly. So this can spin, but the pinion can't float around, which is beautiful. Got a little bit of up and down play, but that's normal. I wouldn't want it mashed together. It'd probably bind and make noise or whatnot. So all in all, not terribly complicated. It looks kind of complicated because you've got this big cage, but this is nothing more than the motor mount giving clearance for the Sprag gear. It's actually not too bad at all. So I'm going to mount this up, get her in there. I guess there's a little bit of fiddling you got to do to get it down properly aligned, get the Sprag gear on far enough. So we're going to play around with that, do a couple of test fits, and I'll report back when I got her all back together. Okay, quick note, I'm putting my motor mount together. I, out of habit, reached for the bolts that came, mounting bolts that came with the motor. These are a nice big hefty 4mm bolt, nice and heavy duty. Can't use these. This cage is, because of the way this Sprag gear mounts, the cage is a lot thinner where the motor mount goes than your typical motor mount. So these are too long. You try to screw them through, they're going to hit the windings inside. The kit does come with 4mm shorters. It's just a few threads shorter. They're just short enough that you're not going to impact the internal workings, touch the copper or the wires coming through there. So make sure that you find your kit and do not use the 4 bolts that came with the motor. Use the slightly shorter bolts that are provided by Miniature Aircraft. One other thing I want to talk about. Nice thing about the HK3 motors, other than they're a little more efficient than the HK2s and a lot more power, they give you the option of both a 25mm bolt spacing and a 30mm bolt spacing. Makes these motors really handy, put them in about anything. Well, Miniature Aircraft took it one step further. This motor mount is drilled for absolutely every combination you can think of. There are 3mm and 4mm holes for 25 and 30. If you rotate this just right, you can actually get all 4 motor bolts into that motor mount, which is fantastic. Being that the Sprag, this is a little bit thinner than you would normally find on a bird like this, that makes me feel even better about it because you've got all 4 bolts holding this plate to the motor. So I'm going to go ahead and get this bolted up. The next time we cut in, I'll have the motor mount and Sprag gear together. Alright guys, well here it is. Motor mount and Sprag assembly together. Pinion spins free. Motor will spin with the pinion. Works really well. One tip, I picked this up off the Heli Freak forums. A couple of guys were, one guy had noticed that he mounted these bolts, but then when he put the pinion support on, these didn't line up in the frame. As you can see, there's really no adjustment there. It's pretty much fixed. A couple of adjustments. There's 3 holes, but they're all going to line up solid. All 4 bolts go in there. Mesh is predetermined. So, what you have to be careful of is that you got the Sprag gear on far enough. I put mine, bottomed it out, and then pulled it up. I mean, maybe a millimeter, just so it's off the bottom. Tighten both. You can rotate this and get your screw through, your set screw through. There is a flat spot on these shafts for the set screw. It lined up perfectly, no problem. I'm hoping that I have it on far enough. It won't go much further on than that, bottom out against the case. But nothing's free, nothing's binding, it's not touching the bolts down in there. I think we're good. I'm going to go ahead and pull the frame over and get this mounted in the frame and see if it all lines up. Okay, something I want to expound on real quick. I made a comment a moment ago about the mesh being somewhat preset, and it is, but I want to explain why this is slotted. The kit comes with a 14-tooth pinion. 13, 14, and 15-tooth pinions are available. Obviously, more teeth, bigger the pinion gear. Fewer teeth, smaller the pinion gear. So what they tell you is if you look at the side of the frame, and this is going to be kind of hard to see on the camera, and I apologize, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts at each mounting point. The upper one's for the motor mount, bottom one's for the pinion support. What they do, you look at the manual, will tell you you're always going to use the outer hole. That's your fixed. But what it tells you, depending upon what tooth pinion you're running, tells you where your hole should line up here. So the back side of the motor and the back side of the pinion support bolt has to be in the right place so that the mesh is correct. With a 14 tooth, they tell you to use the middle hole back here. So that's the 1, 2, 3, 4 holes. The second hole. If you're using a 13 tooth, it's the first hole. And if it's the 15 tooth, you got to come. Excuse me, I got that backwards. 13 tooth is this one. This is closest to the main gear, so this is the closest. 13 tooth is 1, 14 tooth is 2, and 15 tooth is 3. This hole and this hole will always be used. So the mesh is preset. but it is adjustable depending upon which pinion you buy. You're not redrilling your frames. One more thing. I've got the pinion support in there now. Again, I've lined up on the middle hole here for my 14 tooth pinion. Front hole is used. Comes with nice washers. These are nice 3mm bolt holding the pinion and motor mount. It's not going to go anywhere. Two things. One, make sure you orient your pinion support bearing right. I did not do this wrong on this bird, but I did do it wrong on my 600 EFL. You got to make sure the motor is capsulating the pinion bearing. If you put this upside down, the bearing, you'll probably line up, but it's probably two things. One, the pinion's probably going to touch the housing it's not supposed to touch and make noise and vibrate, or at the very least, you're going to push the bearing out the bottom. So make sure that's set up just like the main bearings, so that the pinion and the motor mount hold the bearing in place. Now, I did not actually snug these all the way down. I've learned the hard way over the years on these things. I'm going to get the motor in there, get it all lined up, make sure it all fits, the shaft isn't binding, spins free, and then I will tighten all 4 bolts at the same time. Alright guys, motor is in, Sprag gear together. Two things. One, I originally said you could use all 4 motor mount bolts. I was wrong. The supplied 4mm bolts that would line up to the 25mm inner spacing got in the way of Sprag gear. Sprag gear wouldn't come down onto the shaft far enough for this all to fit. It's supposed to be snug so the pinion doesn't float around, but it has to be free to move, and it was absolutely binding hard, and I couldn't get it to go down anymore. Upon further inspection, I was actually rubbing that screw. So if you need to use a 25mm bolt pattern, you're going to need to use a lower profile bolt. The one that comes with the kit is just too tall. Took those out. I'm more than confident on the two 30mm bolt mountings. They've been putting electric motors on birds with only 2 bolts for a long time. They're 2 4mm bolts, 30mm spacings evenly apart with Loctite, good snug, solid mount. I'm not worried about it. Spins free. Mesh should be perfect. I'm in the middle holes for the 14 tooth. Next step is put the main gear and shaft in and check it. Alright, let's talk about the main gear real quick. Pretty straightforward. CNC Delrin, beefy. I'm beefy. That's every bit of a 1/2 inch thick. I mean, it's absolutely beefy. Very beautiful gear, strong. Because this has a Sprag gear built into the pinion, so the one-way bearing is built into the pinion, there's no need for an auto rotation gear. The transmission for the tail runs off the back side of the main gear, which is nice. Eliminates an extra part to strip. But therefore, the hub is really simple. Basically, you've got 5 counter recessed 3mm bolts. I figured there's a reason why auto manufacturers tell you to torque the 5-star in pattern. It's so you don't warp the hub or cause you a balance issue, or excuse me, a bent rim type situation. So I took the same approach to this. I snugged them down one by one and then torqued them a little bit in a star pattern. Just kind of spread the load around there. Very simple hub, bolts to one side. There are 2 bolts, 2 that go through in clamping style. Then you got 1 big Jesus bolt that's going to go down through the middle to actually key it to the main shaft. It's very strong. It's kind of like it's mounted the same way as the head, basically. You got some clamping pressure on the shaft as well as the Jesus bolt for security. It's very simple, clean design. I'm sure it works well. I'm going to go ahead and get it on the bird, double check my mesh, set my lower pinion support, and we'll go from there. Well guys, here it is. Main shaft is on, lower pinion support is adjusted. Quick note, make sure you go back through. Remember, we did not put Loctite on those lower main shaft support because I had to use it to set the main gear. Now that it's in place, I snugged them all down, then pulled them out one by one, Loctite them, put them back in. So those aren't going anywhere. Main shaft is in. The one-way bearing idea seems to work pretty good. Every once in a while I find a spot where it binds a little bit, but I think that'll probably get better as it wears in and the bearing gets a little, Sprag gear gets a little wear on it, but it spins pretty free and engages. That's the idea. So I'm happy there. Next I'm going to start playing around with my electronics, figure out where I want to put, obviously mount the servos, elevate servo, get the rudder servo in. So electronics placement's pretty straightforward here. This is a gyro mount. Gyro's going to go there. Run the motor wires under it. ESC is going to be up front here, packs around underneath. Since I'm running an RX pack, I will probably mount it actually to the base plate down here. That way we can get it in and out really easy. The packs only hang down to about here. It's a real thin pack that I'm using for my RX packs. I spoke earlier, I thought it was a 4,000, it's actually 2,000 milliamp. 6 volt nickel metal hydride. I'm not running high volt servos. I'll probably only take 2 or 3 flight packs to the field with me at a time. That'll be fine. I can top it off with my portable charging unit while my other packs top up. So I'll start with that. I might end up with a bigger battery. Certainly have plenty of room down there. I'll play with that by ear. So I'm going to take a break, get the servos on, play with the servo, with the ESC mount a little bit. I doubt I'll solder up the ESC and that stuff tonight. Probably save that for tomorrow's video, which will be final setup, final electronics tweaking, head setup, and final thoughts. So tonight I'm just trying to get the basic airframe together. Well guys, here we are. I actually decided to say the heck with it. I'm going to go ahead and put the skids on, put the get up on its feet, show you what the completed frame size looks like, and then I will probably call that a night. I will mount the servos before I start filming tomorrow, because that's pretty straightforward. There's nothing, if I see anything crazy I'm putting them on, I'll stop, but I'm not expecting anything crazy putting servos on. And tomorrow's video will include head setup, final electronics placement, and then we'll put the boom on and go through the V-bar setup. So for tonight, I think I'm just going to put the boom struts on. These are pretty straightforward. These are really beefy, nice thick struts. These actually go into the frame with a 4mm bolt. It's keyed, 2 big holes here, goes on there like that. Rotate this so you can see a little better. So you've got 4 of these arms go in there like that, nice and beefy, and then there are set screws that hold these massive, look at the size of the tube on this landing gear. Absolutely massive, big, brushed aluminum look, looks fantastic. I found my control rod for my crazy tail, and guess what? It's a metal rod, but they give you a little carbon tube you can glue onto it. A, for reinforcement. There's obviously no guides across that little span, and going to look a lot cooler too. So I was happy to see that. Didn't know how that works. So I'm going to go ahead and put the skids on. Come back when the skids are on, and we'll talk about that. Basically completes the airframe. I know I don't have the boom on yet, but that's pretty straightforward. It's 6 bolts holding the boom on. And then I'll do final thoughts on the actual airframe assembly. And tomorrow's video will be servo, electronic setup, flybarless setup, and should be ready to fly this guy Saturday, if the weather holds. Well guys, the basic airframe is done. Put my skids on, skid tubes, nothing really out of the ordinary there, although I will tell you that this tube right here was a really tight fit. I ended up having to put my 10mm feathering shaft wrench on the end and forcing it down, marred it up a little bit. I'm not happy about it, but I guess I could probably buff that, sand that a little bit, probably make it worse. I'll probably leave it alone. But this tube went on no problem. This one was a little tight. You know, it's probably could have taken a little reamer to the plastic and reamed it out, but I didn't realize I was halfway down before I realized I started having a problem. So, but all together, now the bottom plate is nice and solid because those 4 mils go through into those end plates. Very, very solid. Very tall bird. I mean, this guy is easily the tallest of my 700s I've built so far. Head's going to be high off the ground. Low center of gravity. The head's going to be real close to the boom, but the whole thing is pretty tall, and that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. Big birds need flying too. Tail. I'm calling the airframe complete. Obviously, the tail is not on it yet. Again, I'm waiting until I got all the electronics done. I'll put this on last when I'm ready to adjust the tail servo throw. Until then, it's really just going to be cumbersome running wires and turning it around and getting everything pretty. So, but it is together. The airframe is together. I'm going to call that a night for tonight. Tomorrow we will start messing with those, and I will get my ESC and get my speed controller, my V-bar going, get this out of the box, get everything soldered up. The motor came pre-soldered with the typical Scorpion 4mm bullets. I'll go ahead and use those. There's no reason not to. I know a lot of guys like to run 5.5 or 6mm bullets on the motor. I'm not crazy hard banging. I don't even run high C batteries. I can see the benefit. I'm not saying it's a waste of time. It just doesn't. It's not needed with my flight style. A couple of neat things I'm going to do. I am going to run this Fromco Cricket DC Up 2 cap pack as a bit of a buffer for spikes with that nickel metal hydride battery. These servos are rated 6 volts, but they could pull some amps. So, just kind of give them a little bit of buffer. I'm going to run that. Scorpion ESCs require this opto for the phase sensor. So there's my phase wire. And then I went ahead and spent the time and ordered the USB link for the speed controller. Never set up one of these castles with the USB link before. Excuse me, not castle, Scorpions with the USB link before. So we'll get to learn that together. I'm going to call that a night. Appreciate you watching this second of 3 videos. Might end up being 4 videos. We'll see how tomorrow goes. But I think I can get the servos on and get through the setup tomorrow. Alright, have a great night.